Night settles over a lonely farmhouse on the edge of an Irish valley, the fields fading into a soft blur of mist and shadow. Inside, a family keeps a tired vigil at the bedside of an old man whose breathing has grown shallow and slow. The candles burn low. The fire crackles itself towards silence. Then, from somewhere beyond the stone walls, a sound rises. It is not the wind, not an animal, not anything they can name. It is a human voice, and yet not quite human at all. A long, rising keen, torn from a throat that sounds both ancient and female, a cry that seems to know every grief the family has ever carried. Someone whispers a single word, Banshee. They do not rush to the window. They do not open the door. Because everyone in that room has heard the stories that say a lonely fairy woman cries outside the houses of the dying, and that if you hear her voice, it is already too late. According to accounts collected in Irish folklore archives and summarized by folklorist Patricia Lysat, this is exactly how many people in rural Ireland, even well into the 20th century, imagined the moment before death came to their door. But who is this mysterious wailing woman? How did a fairy from the green mounds of myth become a death messenger at the edge of a modern farmhouse? And what exactly are people hearing when they say they heard the cry of the Banshee? You're listening to Beat Nomads: History and Myths Awakened, a show where we explore the deep roots of myths, legends, and the stories that haunt us. Today's episode is called The Cry on the Hill. We're traveling to Ireland and into the wider Gaelic world to meet one of the most famous figures in Celtic folklore, the Banshee, or in Irish, the Banshee, literally the woman of the fairy mound. She is a female spirit whose unearthly wail warns of an approaching death in a family, and her story stretches from medieval manuscripts to modern horror films. In this episode, we'll trace the legend from its earliest written echoes, follow it as it branches into different regional forms, and ask what this mournful figure tells us about how people in Ireland, Scotland, and beyond have understood death, family, and fate. At the heart of it all is a question: how did a fairy woman become a messenger of death, and why does she still cry in our stories today? Now, let's step back and ask, when do we first see anything like the Banshee appear in the record? In Irish, the word we anglicize as Banshee comes from Old Irish benside, bnca in modern spelling, meaning woman of the shiri, the fairy mound. The shio were the ancient burial mounds and hills scattered across the Irish landscape, believed to be the dwellings of supernatural beings, descendants of the pre-Christian gods known as the Tuatha De Danann. According to later summaries of Irish myth, when these gods were defeated, they were said to retreat beneath the earth and become the Aes Shia, the people of the mounds. And a Beansai was understood as a female member of that otherworldly race. So originally, the term Beansai did not mean screaming death hag. It meant something closer to otherworld woman. And only over time did one particular kind of Beansai, the one who keens for the dead, become the Banshee in popular imagination. The earliest written traces of a figure recognizably like the Banshee appear in medieval and later Irish literature. According to the article on the Banshee in standard reference works, accounts mentioning a fairy woman who foretells death reach back at least to the 14th century text Catraim Tuair Dielbhai, The Triumphs of Torlo, from County Clare, which describes prophetic fairy women connected to noble families. Folklorist Ruth Atkins, writing for the Irish history podcast Unreal, notes that medieval tales speak of such women as seers and guardians of families long before the term banshee became fixed as a death omen. This is one of those moments where we need to separate what we know from what we suspect. We have written evidence from the later Middle Ages that Irish storytellers already imagined powerful fairy women who could foresee or announce doom. It is very likely that oral traditions about such beings are older than the surviving manuscripts, but as scholars like Patricia Lysat are careful to point out, we cannot date that oral layer with precision. So, the earliest firmly documented banshee-like figures come from medieval texts, while the belief itself almost certainly grew out of a much older oral landscape. By the early modern period, we start to see something closer to the familiar banshee image, 18th and 19th century descriptions collected by antiquarians and lexicographers talk about she-fairies attached to old Irish families who sing mournful laments outside the house whenever a death is near. An 18th century Irish-English dictionary compiled by John O'Brien explains that bean sai, women fairies, were thought to be so devoted to certain ancient noble lines that they would be heard to sing around their houses by night when a family member lay gravely ill. Folklorist Patricia Lysott, whose 1986 monograph, The Banshee, the Irish Supernatural Death Messenger, remains the most detailed study of the subject, argues that by the time such accounts were written down, beliefs about a solitary female death messenger were already fully developed in Gaelic Ireland. Drawing on hundreds of oral testimonies and archival records from the 20th century, Lysott concludes that the Banshee was understood not as a random wandering specter, but as a supernatural figure attached to particular families, who manifested at liminal moments of sickness and death. So, from the very beginning of the written record, two ideas travel side by side: a fairy woman from the mounds of the other world, and a specialized version of that figure whose wail announces the end of a human life. As we move forward, those two threads will twist together into the Banshee we think we know. Now, as the legend settles into the everyday life of rural Ireland, the Banshee becomes something more intimate and, in a strange way, almost domestic. She is no longer just an abstract fairy. It is said she belongs to your family. According to 19th and 20th century folklore accounts, the Banshee is most often associated with families of Old Gaelic origin, particularly those whose surnames begin with O or Mac, names understood to descend from the so-called Milesian stock of Ireland. The article on the Banshee and major reference works notes that tradition held she would not keen for those of purely Norman or English descent, although there were famous exceptions for families who had, as one writer put it, become more Irish than the Irish themselves. Lysott's survey of collected testimonies shows that in many districts, people could name the specific families said to have their own Banshee, and sometimes even give the spirit a personal name like Abel, who was described as the Banshee of the O'Briens and the queen of a host of other death messengers. In these stories, the Banshee rarely appears indoors. Instead, she is heard or briefly seen outside the house on a nearby hill or by the family burial ground. Witnesses describe her as an old woman with long, streaming hair and red, swollen eyes from ceaseless weeping, wrapped in a gray cloak over a green dress, colors that echo both mourning clothes and the fairy world. Other accounts, cited by writers like Lady Wilde in the 19th century, note her shifting appearance, while modern scholars describe her as shifting between three forms: a beautiful young woman, a dignified matron, and a withered hag, figures that many Celticists connect to earlier triple goddesses of war and fate. However she looks, the Banshee is defined above all by sound. To understand that, we have to talk about keening. In Irish and Scottish tradition, a bean cowant, literally keening woman, was a mourner who sang improvised laments called cowanead at wakes and funerals. These performances could be professional, the best keeners were sought after, and their art involved naming the dead, praising their lineage, and giving shape to communal grief. Irish legend, as summarized in the Banshee entry and in modern folklore podcasts, speaks of a fairy woman who sings such a lament when a family member dies or is about to die, sometimes even when the death happens far away, with the supernatural cry reaching the home before any human messenger. Scholars like Lysott and others have argued that the Banshee's wail is best understood as a supernatural extension of this human keening tradition, a way to imagine that even when no living mourner can be present, the ancient world of the Shui will not let the dead pass unmarked. Here we can correct a common modern misconception. In many horror films, comics, and games, the Banshee is portrayed as a monster whose scream kills, a kind of sonic weapon that slays anyone who hears it. But in the body of Irish folklore examined by Lysott, and in the older literary and oral sources, the Banshee does not cause death, she announces it. An 1888 collection of Irish wonders, for example, describes her song as, at times, a low, soft chant, more like a tender farewell than a threat, especially when she loves the one she calls. The fear her cry inspires comes not from any attack, but from the knowledge that she never sings without reason. That does not make her comforting. Testimonies gathered in the 20th century and discussed by Lysot describe people who were terrified to hear a keening voice where no living woman could be, or to see a small figure in white or gray, wringing her hands, on a hill near the house, on the very night a relative died, miles away. But within the communities that told these stories, the Banshee's presence also affirmed something, that this family mattered, that their dead were noticed by powers older than any landlord or government. So far, we've followed the Banshee to the doorstep and listened to her song. But in other places, she steps away from the house and down to the water, and there her story takes on a new shape. In many stories, the Banshee does not simply stand outside and wail. She sits by a stream or bends over a dark pool, combing her long hair or washing something in the water. These images turn out to be part of a much wider network of symbols. Scholars have noted that in Irish and broader European folklore, supernatural women are often depicted combing their hair with a special comb, sometimes golden or silver, sometimes lost or stolen. An article comparing the Irish Banshee and the Slavic Rusalka, the water spirit, points out that both figures are occasionally described as sitting and combing their long hair, and that in many European traditions, to pick up a comb dropped by such a being is to invite disaster. Modern summaries of Patricia Lysat's work note that she interprets some comb stories attached to the Banshee as later additions, influenced by local mermaid lore and wider European tales about dangerous, beautiful women at the water's edge. Then there is the washer. In Scottish Gaelic tradition, a closely related figure appears under the name Bean Nega, literally washerwoman or washing woman, described in detail in folklore collections and summarized in reference works. She is said to haunt desolate streams, washing the blood-stained clothes or grave clothes of those who are about to die, and like the Irish Banshee, she is regarded as an omen of death and a messenger from the other world. On the Isle of Skye, she might look like a small, pitiful child. In other regions, she is small and rotund, dressed in green, or strangely deformed, with webbed feet or a single protruding tooth. The Bean Nye, however, comes with an added twist. According to legends recorded in the Highlands and Islands, if you manage to approach her from behind and seize her, you can force her to reveal who is about to die, and in some tales, she must then grant you 3 wishes. Other versions say that if she sees you first, you may lose the use of your limbs, a reminder that mortals approach the machinery of fate at their peril. Some traditions, reported in Scottish folklore collections, even claim that these washerwomen are the spirits of women who died in childbirth, condemned to wash until the time they would have died naturally. Irish material also knows a washer at the ford. Writers on Celtic mythology have long pointed to a chilling scene in one version of the Ulster cycle, the medieval tales of the hero Cuchulainn, where he encounters a figure, sometimes identified as Bab, washing the bloodied garments of a warrior at a ford, an omen that he is riding to his death. Modern discussions of the Banshee's origins often link this image of the fate goddess at the water's edge with later tales of the Bean Nige and the Banshee, who washes grave clothes in the stream. The water, the comb, the washing, these are not just eerie details. As the article on the comb motif argues, long hair and its combing often mark supernatural female power, danger, and sexuality, while the act of washing blood-stained clothes before a death suggests a being who moves slightly ahead of time, tidying up the future before it arrives. In modern terms, these legends describe what we might call a liminal figure, someone who stands at the threshold between life and death, between the home and the wild, between the human community and the mysterious landscape that surrounds it. So, we've seen the Banshee and her close cousins move from the doorstep to the stream, from keening to combing and washing. But behind all of these forms lies a deeper question. Who was she before she became a solitary, sobbing fairy woman? What happens to a goddess when her people change their religion, their politics, and their sense of the world? One answer, suggested by several scholars of Celtic tradition, is that she becomes a ghost. Patricia Lysat's work, together with earlier folklore scholarship, emphasizes that the Banshee is a solitary female of the otherworld who appears attached to particular lineages, often noble ones. A review of her book notes that she may well have begun as a patron goddess and personification of the land itself, before shrinking in status to a household-scale death messenger in later belief. Popular encyclopedias of myth echo this, pointing out that the Banshee's threefold appearances as maiden, matron, and crone parallel the triple war and sovereignty goddesses of early Irish mythology, such as Bab, Macha, and Nemain, collectively called the Morrigan. Modern essays on the Banshee's origins trace a line from the Tuatha De Danann, the pre-Christian divine race, to the Aes Sedai, or people of the mounds, and from there to individual fairy women like the Banshee. According to these interpretations, when Christianity took root in Ireland, the old goddesses did not vanish overnight. Instead, their stories were recast, sometimes demonized, sometimes domesticated, sometimes transformed into saints, and sometimes, as in this case, into liminal figures half feared and half respected. At the same time, the Banshee legend absorbed influences from very human ritual. As we heard earlier, the role of the professional keener was central to Irish funeral practice, especially before 20th century social changes. The Bone and Sickle folklore program notes that recordings of traditional keening, such as a field recording made in 1955-56 and released on Folkways Records in 1957, give us a visceral sense of the kind of sound people would have associated with death long before they spoke of banshees. Lysott and other scholars argue that when people began to speak of a mysterious, disembodied lament outside the house, a lament that sometimes seemed to come from nowhere, it was natural to imagine that the keening woman herself had become supernatural. In this light, the Banshee is neither simply a fairy nor simply a ghost. She is a fusion of earlier divine figures of fate and sovereignty, human mourners who gave voice to grief, and the powerful Irish sense that the landscape itself, its mounds, hills, and streams, is populated by beings who watch and respond to human life. So far, we've followed the Banshee from goddess to keener, from fairy woman of the mounds to private herald of family tragedy. But what does she mean to the people who kept telling her story, and why does she continue to haunt modern culture? Now that we've walked through the misty lanes of Banshee legend, let's ask what this figure actually does for the people who believe in her. In her extensive survey of Irish testimony, Patricia Lysott found that the Banshee belief was strongest in rural communities where family identity, land, and lineage were tightly intertwined. In these contexts, to say that a family had a Banshee was not simply to say they were cursed. It could be a marker of status, a supernatural acknowledgement that this was an old line with deep roots. Listeners to the Folklore Collections podcast, Bluerini Bealoidis, will hear Lysott describe how the Banshee's cry expressed attitudes toward death, sometimes fearful, sometimes resigned, sometimes almost welcoming, as part of a broader culture in which death and the dead remain close to the living. Writers like Peter Beresford Ellis and modern educators at sites such as Irish Myths and Mythos Anthology point out that the Banshee is not just about fear. She also affirms the idea that no one in the family dies unnoticed. If you imagine a fairy woman keening for your kin, then even a lonely death far from home becomes part of a larger story. The lament says, someone beyond the veil has seen this and grieves with you. At the same time, the Banshee encodes anxieties about sudden, violent, or distant deaths. Stories of the bean nigh washing bloody clothes, or of a Banshee wailing before news arrives of an accident, speak to the unpredictability of life in societies where emigration, war, and dangerous work were constant realities. In that sense, the legend is a way of giving form to the random. If a cry foretold it, then perhaps it was not random after all. Modern scholars are cautious about drawing straight lines between legend and historical event. We do not have evidence that Banshee beliefs caused any particular behavior, no records of people refusing to travel solely because of a mysterious cry, but we do have plenty of accounts in National Folklore Collection archives of people taking the sound as a serious warning, or at least an omen to be remembered when misfortune struck. Lysott notes that in many narratives, the Banshee's appearance is later woven into the family's memory of a death, retold at wakes and anniversaries as part of how the loss is made meaningful. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Banshee has also taken on a second life in popular culture. She appears in films and television, in fantasy novels and role-playing games, often stripped of her specific Irish context and turned into a generic, screaming monster whose wail kills indiscriminately. Writers on modern folklore stress that these versions are creative reimaginings rather than faithful reflections of the older tradition. They borrow the eerie sound and the female ghostly form but detach them from the family-based, lineage-conscious world of Gaelic belief. At the same time, some contemporary Irish and Scottish storytellers, podcasters, and artists are revisiting the Banshee through a more culturally grounded lens. Podcasts, produced in collaboration with University College Dublin's National Folklore Collection, for instance, invite Lysot herself to discuss how archival recordings preserve authentic Banshee lore, from names and descriptions to the emotional weight of the cry. Articles aimed at the general public, like those on Irish myths or dedicated Banshee-focused blogs, explicitly correct misconceptions, emphasizing that the Banshee announces death rather than causing it, and highlighting her roots in Gaelic spirituality and funeral ritual. So what does all of this mean for us now? In a world where many deaths occur in hospitals and are managed by professionals, the idea of a personal, almost intimate death messenger attached to the family can feel both archaic and strangely appealing. The Banshee symbolizes a relationship to mortality in which death is not merely a medical event, but a passage accompanied by story, sound, and a sense of being noticed by forces beyond ourselves. So, what have we learned from following the cry on the hill? We began with a fairy woman of the mounds, the Bean Sai, whose roots lie in the otherworldly beings of early Irish myth and in powerful goddesses like the Morrigan. We traced how, in medieval and later sources, she narrowed into a specific figure, a solitary, family-attached death messenger whose keening cry echoed the very real laments of human keening women at Irish wakes. We watched her take different shapes, as the Banshee at the door, the hair-combing woman by the stream, the Scottish Bean Nye washing grave clothes, and saw how scholars link these forms to older symbols of fate and to changing social worlds. Above all, we discovered that the Banshee is not just a horror trope. She is a mirror of how communities think about death, lineage, and the unseen. Her cry is a voice for grief, a sign that no one, in the end, passes entirely alone. If you'd like to go deeper into the Banshee's world, I highly recommend looking into the work of folklorist Patricia Lysat, along with the collections of the National Folklore Collection at University College Dublin, where many of the first-hand accounts we've talked about are preserved. These sources show just how rich and varied the legend really is beyond the jump scares. That's it for this episode of Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened. If you enjoyed this journey into Irish legend, the best way to support the show is to follow the podcast and leave a review wherever you're listening. It helps other listeners find these stories and keeps the legends alive. Next time, we'll talk about Dagda, the good god, the chief god of the Tuatha De Danann, a father figure, king, and druid. Until then, listen closely when the night grows quiet. You never know who might be singing just beyond the hill.